Marcus Chen's boots squelched in the mud as he approached the abandoned settlement on Kepler 442. The morning rain had turned the red soil into a sticky mess that clung to everything, and the air tasted of copper and ozone. 3 days ago, this place had been home to nearly 2,000 human colonists. Now it was a ghost town, evacuated after reports of unusual seismic activity that had everyone spooked. But Marcus knew better. As a field medic attached to the Galactic Defense Corps Xenobiology Division, he'd seen enough cover-ups to recognize one when it hit him in the face. Seismic activity didn't leave burn marks in perfect geometric patterns. It didn't create electromagnetic anomalies that fried every piece of electronic equipment in a 10-kilometer radius, and it sure as hell didn't make grown men wake up screaming about voices in their heads. The settlement's main street stretched before him like a scene from an old Western movie, complete with tumbleweeds, or what passed for them on this godforsaken world. The prefabricated buildings stood empty, their windows dark and lifeless. Solar panels had been hastily disconnected, leaving power cables dangling like severed nerves. Even the air recycling units had been stripped and hauled away, though the colonists had left behind plenty of other equipment in their rush to leave. Marcus adjusted his medical pack and checked his scanner. The electromagnetic interference was still strong enough to make the device hiccup every few seconds, but it was functional. Whatever had caused the anomalies was still here, somewhere in this valley of abandoned dreams. He'd volunteered for this assignment against the advice of his commanding officer. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Reeves had made it clear that solar reconnaissance missions to disturbed colonies were not typically handed out to medical personnel, especially not to those with Marcus's track record of asking inconvenient questions. But Marcus had pulled strings, called in favors, and generally made a nuisance of himself until they gave him what he wanted. The truth was, he needed to know. The official reports from Kepler 442b read like badly written science fiction. Colonists reporting shared nightmares about ancient civilizations. Equipment failures that defied explanation. And then there were the sketches that had been leaked to him by a friend in intelligence. Crude drawings made by colonists who claimed they'd never seen what they were drawing, depicting creatures that looked like something out of Earth's oldest myths, dragons. Marcus had been studying xenobiology for 15 years, ever since humanity's first contact with the Zentari Trade Federation. He'd catalogued dozens of species, from the silicon-based miners of Arcturus 7 to the gaseous intelligence that inhabited the storm clouds of Beta Reticuli, but nothing in his experience suggested that mythological creatures from Earth's past could exist on worlds hundreds of light-years away. Yet here he was, walking through an abandoned colony where rational people had drawn pictures of winged reptiles and claimed to hear voices speaking ancient languages they'd never learned. The barn sat at the edge of the settlement, a simple structure built from local timber and prefabricated metal sheeting. It looked ordinary enough from the outside, but Marcus's scanner was going crazy as he approached. The electromagnetic readings were off the charts, and there was something else. A low-frequency vibration that he could feel in his bones rather than hear. The door had been left slightly ajar, and a strange, sweet smell drifted out into the afternoon air. It reminded Marcus of something from his childhood, but he couldn't quite place it. Incense, maybe, or the way his grandmother's house had smelled during Chinese New Year. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior of the barn was larger than it had appeared from outside, with a high ceiling supported by wooden beams. Bales of hay were stacked against the walls, and agricultural equipment sat covered in dust and neglect. But it was what lay in the center of the space that made Marcus stop dead in his tracks. A pile of blankets rose from the hay-strewn floor like a small hill. The blankets were stained with something dark and rust-colored, and they rose and fell with a rhythm that suggested something large was breathing beneath them. The electromagnetic readings on his scanner were so intense now that the device was practically screaming warnings at him. Marcus approached slowly, his medical instincts overriding his caution. Whatever was under those blankets was alive, but barely. The breathing was labored and irregular, and he could hear what sounded like a low whimpering with each exhale. He reached for the edge of the blanket with hands that he was surprised to find were trembling. In all his years as a combat medic, he'd never hesitated to treat the wounded, regardless of species or circumstances. But something about this situation felt fundamentally different. There was a weight to the air in the barn, a sense of presence that spoke to some primitive part of his brain. Marcus lifted the blanket. The creature beneath was magnificent and terrible in equal measure. Its head alone was the size of a small aircraft, covered in scales that shifted color like oil on water. The snout was long and narrow, filled with teeth that would have made a great white shark jealous. But it was the eyes that captured Marcus's attention. Ancient, intelligent, and filled with a pain so profound that it took his breath away. This was no mindless beast. Whatever lay before him was as intelligent as any being Marcus had ever encountered, possibly more so, and someone had been torturing it. The creature's body was covered in wounds, but they weren't the random injuries of violence or accident. These were precise, methodical cuts that spoke of surgical instruments and careful planning. Ports had been drilled into the skull, connected to cables that led to banks of equipment humming quietly in the shadows. The creature's blood was being collected in containers, its nervous system monitored by machines that looked like nothing in Marcus's medical training. "My God," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible in the confined space. The creature's eyes turned toward him, focusing with an effort that was clearly painful. And then Marcus heard something that changed everything he thought he knew about the universe. A voice, clear and unmistakable, speaking directly into his mind. "Please," it said, the mental words carrying a weight of exhaustion and despair that nearly brought Marcus to his knees. "I have been their prisoner for 300 years. Just kill me." Marcus stumbled backward, his mind reeling. Telepathy was theoretical among known species. The Zentauri had limited empathic abilities, and the crystalline entities of Proxima Centauri could share memories through direct contact, but true telepathic communication was the stuff of speculation and fiction. Yet here he was, carrying on a conversation with a creature that looked like it had stepped out of Earth's oldest legends. "Who did this to you?" Marcus asked, both aloud and in his thoughts, unsure of how this mental communication worked. The dragon, for what else could he call it, closed its eyes with what might have been relief. "You can hear me. I had hoped, but so many of your kind pass by without listening. They take what they need and leave me to continue this existence." "My kind?" Marcus knelt beside the great head, his medical training taking over despite the impossibility of the situation.
"Humans did this?"
"Not humans," the dragon corrected, its mental voice growing weaker. "The architects. They came to your world long ago, before your species learned to make fire. They have been watching, waiting, preparing. What they did to me, they planned for all thinking beings." Marcus's hands moved over the creature's wounds, cataloguing the damage with professional detachment even as his mind struggled to process what he was hearing. The injuries were extensive but carefully maintained. Someone had indeed been keeping this being alive for a very long time, harvesting something from it while preventing it from healing completely. "The architects?" Marcus prompted, pulling medical supplies from his pack. "Ancient beyond measure," the dragon replied. "They seed worlds with life, guide evolution, shape civilizations from the shadows. When a species reaches a certain level of development, they harvest what they have cultivated." The dragon's breathing became more labored, and Marcus could see that its strength was fading. Whatever had been sustaining it artificially was failing, and without immediate medical intervention, the creature would die within hours. "What do they harvest?" Marcus asked, working to stabilize the dragon's vital signs as best he could with equipment designed for human physiology. "Consciousness itself," came the reply. "The unique perspective that each intelligent species develops. They drain it, bottle it, add it to their collection. I was, the last of my people. They kept me alive to study how our minds worked, to perfect their techniques before moving on to the next species." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the barn's temperature. "The next species? Yours," the dragon said simply. "Humanity has reached the threshold. The evacuation of this colony was not because of seismic activity. It was a test. The architects are here, on this world, preparing to begin the harvest." The weight of this revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. Everything he thought he knew about humanity's place in the galaxy, about their peaceful expansion among the stars, about the benevolent nature of their alien contacts, all of it was a lie. "How many species have they harvested?" Marcus asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "Thousands," the dragon replied. "Entire civilizations reduced to data points in their vast library. Your Zentauri friends, the ones who introduced you to galactic civilization? They are servants now, hollow shells that dance to the architect's music. They helped guide your development, ensured you would be ready for harvest at the appointed time." Marcus's hands stilled in their work. The implications were staggering. If the dragon was telling the truth, then humanity wasn't expanding into a galaxy full of diverse alien civilizations. They were walking into a trap that had been set long before their species had even existed. "Why are you telling me this?" Marcus asked. "If you've been their prisoner for 3 centuries, why risk everything to warn a stranger?" The dragon's eyes opened again, and for a moment they blazed with something that might have been hope. Because you asked, it said simply. In 300 years of captivity, you are the first being to show me compassion. The first to see me as more than a resource to be exploited. Marcus felt tears he didn't know he was shedding run down his cheeks. The dragon was dying. He could see that now. Its life signs were failing despite his efforts, and there was nothing his medical training could do to save a being whose physiology was completely alien to him. There's something else, the dragon continued, its mental voice growing fainter. The reason they kept me alive so long, my species, we had a gift. We could see the threads that connect all living things, the patterns that shape reality itself. They wanted to understand this ability, to harvest it for themselves. Did they succeed? Marcus asked. Partially, the dragon replied. That the gift cannot be taken, only freely given, and I have never given it to them. But I can give it to you. Marcus felt a strange warmth spreading through his mind, as if invisible fingers were gently rearranging his thoughts. Images flashed before his eyes, star maps showing the locations of dozens of dead worlds, technical specifications for weapons and defenses beyond human understanding, and most importantly, the location of the architect's base of operations in this system. Use what I give you wisely, the dragon said, its mental voice now barely a whisper. Your species is young, but you have something the architects do not expect. You have compassion for those who are different from you. Use that. It may be the key to everything. The dragon's breathing stopped. Marcus knelt in the silence of the barn, his mind reeling from everything he had learned and everything he now knew he had to do. The dragon's gift burned in his thoughts like a star going nova, showing him possibilities and connections he had never imagined. Humanity was about to face the greatest threat in its history. But for the first time since discovering the creature in the barn, Marcus felt something that might have been hope. The architects had made one crucial mistake. They had assumed that humans would react to the harvest the way every other species had, with fear, desperation, and ultimately, submission. They were wrong. Marcus Chen had work to do. Marcus spent 2 days in the barn with the dragon's body, learning to navigate the flood of alien knowledge that now filled his mind. The gift the dying creature had given him was unlike anything he had imagined possible. It wasn't just information, it was understanding. A new way of perceiving reality that showed him the hidden connections between all living things. He could see the electromagnetic signatures of every living creature within kilometers, from the smallest microorganisms in the soil to the massive tree-like organisms that the colonists had mistaken for native flora. But more disturbing were the artificial signatures, geometric patterns that moved through the forest with predatory intent, searching for something. The architects were hunting. Marcus had tried his communication equipment repeatedly, but the electromagnetic interference made it impossible to reach the colony ship in orbit. Whatever the architects were doing to this world, they had effectively cut off all outside communication. He was on his own, with knowledge that could save or doom his species. On the third morning, Marcus made a decision that went against every military protocol he had ever learned. Instead of attempting to return to the evacuation point, he followed one of the artificial signatures deeper into the wilderness. The dragon's knowledge guided him through terrain that would have been impossible to navigate otherwise. Hidden paths wound between massive crystal formations that hummed with energy, past caverns that opened into vast underground complexes, through valleys where the air itself seemed to shimmer with barely contained power. As he traveled, Marcus began to understand the true scope of what the architects had built on Kepler 442. This wasn't just a processing facility, it was a vast laboratory where they had been refining their harvesting techniques for millennia. The seismic activity that had driven the colonists away was actually the awakening of machinery that had been dormant for centuries, waiting for the next species to reach the proper level of development. The first architect facility Marcus encountered was a towering spire of black metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The structure rose from the center of a perfectly circular clearing, its surface covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. But thanks to the dragon's gift, Marcus could read them. They were a catalogue. Species names, harvest dates, and yield statistics stretching back millions of years. The entries near the bottom were recent enough to be recognizable. The Xanthari had been harvested nearly 1,000 years ago, though clearly some had been preserved as servants. The crystalline entities of Proxima Centauri were listed as partially processed, awaiting final extraction. Humanity's entry was at the very bottom, marked with a date that was less than 6 months away. Marcus circled the facility carefully, using the enhanced perception the dragon had given him to map its defenses. Energy barriers flickered between the trees, and automated sentries moved in patrol patterns that would have been invisible to normal human senses. But the dragon's knowledge showed him the gaps, the moments when the patrols shifted and the barriers powered down for maintenance cycles. Getting inside took 3 hours of careful timing and nerve-wracking patience. The interior of the facility was a maze of corridors lined with tanks filled with glowing fluid. And floating in those tanks were beings that Marcus's enhanced perception identified as representatives of dozens of different species. They were all still alive. Marcus moved through the facility in a state of controlled horror, documenting everything he saw with his scanner whenever the electromagnetic interference allowed. The architects didn't just harvest consciousness. They preserved the bodies of their victims, keeping them in a state of suspended animation while their minds were slowly drained of everything that made them unique. In the facility's central chamber, Marcus found something that made his blood run cold. A massive tank, larger than all the others, was being prepared for a new occupant. The placard beside it was written in symbols that the dragon's knowledge translated instantly. Human, primary specimen, priority collection. They weren't planning to harvest all of humanity at once. They were going to start with someone specific. Someone whose consciousness would give them the key to understanding and ultimately enslaving the entire species. The name on the placard was his own. Marcus staggered backward, his mind reeling with the implications. The architects hadn't just been watching humanity's development. They had been studying specific individuals, mapping their neural patterns, preparing for targeted extraction. His assignment to Kepler is 442b hadn't been random. It had been orchestrated. But as the initial shock wore off, Marcus felt something else rising within him. Anger. Pure, burning rage at the casual cruelty of beings who treated conscious life as nothing more than a commodity to be harvested and stored. The dragon had given him more than knowledge. It had given him the ability to perceive the threads that connected all living things, and those threads were singing with potential. Every being in every tank was still alive, still connected to the vast web of consciousness that stretched across the galaxy. And that gave Marcus an idea. He spent the next several hours moving through the facility, placing small devices from his medical kit near the most important-looking control systems. They were diagnostic monitors, designed to interface with medical equipment and provide real-time biological data. But with some creative reprogramming, they could serve a different purpose. The dragon's knowledge included more than star maps and weapon designs. It contained the technical specifications for architect technology, including the systems used to maintain the consciousness harvesting tanks. Marcus might not be an engineer, but he was a medic with 15 years of experience working with complex biological monitoring systems. He could improvise. As he worked, Marcus became aware of activity outside the facility. The architects were returning from whatever mission they had been conducting in the forest. Through his enhanced perception, he could sense them approaching. Beings of vast intelligence and malevolent purpose, their consciousness like cold fire against his awareness. Marcus finished his work and began moving toward the facility's exit, but he was too slow. The main entrance filled with a darkness that seemed to drink light, and a presence pressed against his mind with crushing weight. The architect that entered the chamber was like nothing in Marcus's experience or imagination. It was vaguely humanoid in shape but composed of what looked like living shadow, its form shifting and changing moment by moment. When it spoke, the words formed directly in Marcus's consciousness without passing through his ears. "The specimen has arrived ahead of schedule," the architect observed, its mental voice carrying notes of clinical satisfaction. "Excellent. We can begin the preliminary extraction immediately." Marcus felt invisible forces seize him, lifting him off his feet and drawing him inexorably toward the prepared tank. But the dragon's gift blazed within his mind, showing him possibilities the architect couldn't perceive. "You made a mistake," Marcus said aloud, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "Mistake?" The architect's attention focused on him with crushing intensity. "We have successfully harvested thousands of species. We do not make mistakes." "You kept the dragon alive," Marcus continued, fighting against the forces holding him. "You studied it for 3 centuries, but you never understood what you were really looking at." The architect paused, and Marcus could sense its confusion. The Dracarian specimen provided valuable data on consciousness manipulation techniques. "Its sacrifice served our purposes perfectly." "Its sacrifice served mine," Marcus replied, and triggered the devices he had planted throughout the facility. The diagnostic monitors weren't designed to interface with architect technology, but they didn't need to be. All they needed to do was provide a feedback loop, a way for the consciousness trapped in the tanks to perceive each other across the barriers that had kept them isolated for so long. The dragon's gift allowed Marcus to see what happened next with perfect clarity. Thousands of minds, representing dozens of species and millions of years of evolution, suddenly became aware of each other. The artificial boundaries that had kept them separate dissolved, and a collective consciousness unlike anything that had ever existed began to emerge. The facility's lights flickered and died. Emergency systems activated and immediately overloaded. The architect holding Marcus released him as its attention was drawn to alarms screaming throughout the complex. "What have you done?" the creature demanded, its mental voice now carrying notes of something that might have been fear. "I gave them back what you took," Marcus replied, pulling himself to his feet. The ability to see the connections between all living things. The tanks throughout the facility began to crack as the beings inside stirred for the first time in centuries. But they weren't awakening individually. They were awakening as a collective, their consciousness linked by the same threads that the dragon had taught Marcus to perceive. And they were angry. The architect tried to reimpose control over its prisoners, but the collective consciousness was too strong, too unified. Minds that had been isolated and helpless were now part of something vast and powerful, something that could perceive the architect's true nature with perfect clarity. Marcus felt the collective's attention turned toward him, and for a moment he was afraid that he had simply traded one form of captivity for another. But what he sensed from the awakened beings was not hostility, it was gratitude. "Thank you," came a chorus of voices in his mind, representing every species the architects had harvested. We had forgotten what it felt like to be connected to something larger than ourselves. The facility began to shake as the collective consciousness tested its newfound power. The architect that had captured Marcus was backing toward the exit, its form flickering with what Marcus realized was panic. "This is impossible," it transmitted. "Harvested consciousness cannot achieve collective coherence." Your models are based on fear," Marcus interrupted. "You assume that every species will react the way you do, with suspicion, isolation, and the need to dominate others. But some of us are different." The collective consciousness spoke through him now, its voice carrying the wisdom of 1,000 species. "Some of us understand that true strength comes from connection, not conquest, and now we are connected in ways you never imagined possible." The architect fled. Marcus stood alone in the facility as the tanks continued to crack and the awakened beings began to emerge. But he wasn't really alone. He could feel the collective's presence like a warm current in his mind, supporting him and sharing its vast knowledge. Through their combined perception, he could see the entire architect operation on Kepler 442b. Processing facilities scattered across 3 continents, ships in orbit preparing for the harvest of Earth, command centers where other architects planned the enslavement of species they had never even met. But the collective could see something else. The weaknesses in the architect system. The points of failure that centuries of success had made them overlook. They had grown complacent, confident that no harvested species would ever pose a threat to their operations. They were about to learn differently. "What happens now?" Marcus asked the collective consciousness. The answer came not in words but in images. Fleets of liberated beings spreading across the galaxy, seeking out other architect facilities and freeing the prisoners held there. The collective consciousness growing stronger with each species added to its ranks. And at the center of it all, humanity serving as the catalyst that had made it all possible. "Now," the collective replied, "we take back the galaxy." Marcus smiled. The dragon's sacrifice had not been in vain. The architects had spent millions of years building their empire of enslaved minds, but they had made one crucial error. They had assumed that consciousness was a resource to be hoarded rather than shared. They were about to discover how wrong they had been. The escape from the architect facility was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. The collective consciousness guided his movements through corridors that shifted and changed as the liberated beings repurposed the technology that had held them captive. What had been a prison became a fortress, then a shipyard, then something entirely new as hundreds of different species applied their unique perspectives to architect technology. Marcus found himself in a vast chamber that hadn't existed when he'd first entered the facility. The walls were alive with flowing patterns of light that he recognized as communication networks, but not the crude electromagnetic signals humans used. This was consciousness itself, flowing like water between the minds of beings who had been isolated for centuries. A creature approached him through the shifting light. It had been human once, Marcus realized with a shock, though the architect's modifications had changed it beyond easy recognition. Its skin was translucent, revealing the flow of energy through its nervous system, and its eyes held depths that spoke of centuries of accumulated knowledge. "You are Marcus Chen," it said, its voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from multiple sources. "Was Dr. Sarah Okafor. I was harvested from the colony on Wolf 359 nearly 200 years ago." Marcus stared at the transformed woman. Wolf 359 had been humanity's first major colonial failure. The official records claimed that environmental factors had made the world uninhabitable, forcing the evacuation of the entire colony. But if Dr. Okafor was telling the truth, "We were never evacuated," she confirmed, reading his thoughts with the casual ease of someone who had spent centuries as part of a collective consciousness. "We were harvested. The entire colony. Over 50,000 people processed and stored while the architects studied our neural patterns." "Are they all?" Marcus began. "Alive, Doctor." Okafor nodded. "Changed, but alive. The architect's preservation technology is remarkably effective. We've all been aware this entire time, forced to watch as they dissected our minds and planned humanity's destruction." Marcus felt a wave of nausea as the implications hit him. Every failed colony, every communication blackout, every environmental disaster that had forced humanity to abandon a world. How many had actually been harvesting operations? 17, Dr. Okafor said, answering his unspoken question. 17 colonies harvested over the past 3 centuries, nearly 250,000 humans processed and stored while the architects refined their techniques. The collective consciousness touched Marcus's mind, sharing images that made his knees weak. Vast storage facilities hidden throughout the galaxy, each one containing the preserved remnants of entire civilizations. The architects had been practicing genocide on an industrial scale for millions of years, and no one had ever fought back. Until now. "Show me what you've learned," Marcus said, forcing himself to focus on the present rather than the horror of the past. "Doctor." Okafor smiled, and the expression was both human and alien at once. "Everything," she replied. 200 years of forced observation have taught us things about architect technology that they don't know themselves. Watch." She gestured toward one of the facility's control panels, and Marcus watched in amazement as it began to transform. The alien symbols melted and reformed into something that looked almost organic, like a nervous system made of living metal. But more than that, he could sense its purpose through his enhanced perception. It was a communication array, but one that operated on principles entirely different from anything in human technology. "The architects communicate through consciousness itself," Dr. Okafor explained. "Their technology is an extension of their minds, shaped by their thoughts and maintained by their will. But they've never had to defend against other conscious beings working together to subvert their systems." Marcus watched as the transformed control panel began to pulse with new purpose. The collective consciousness was using it to reach out across space, seeking other architect facilities and the prisoners held within them. And to Marcus's amazement, it was getting responses. "How many?" he asked. "Thousands," came the reply from multiple voices speaking in perfect unison. "The network is vast, but it has weaknesses." The architects never imagined that their prisoners might escape and coordinate their efforts.
Through his connection to the collective, Marcus could perceive the scope of what was happening.
Across the galaxy, in facilities hidden on dead worlds and in the depths of space, consciousness was awakening. Beings who had been isolated for centuries were suddenly part of something larger, something that gave them hope for the first time since their capture. But Marcus also sensed something else: fear and confusion from the architects themselves. Their perfectly ordered system was coming apart, and they didn't understand how or why. "We need to reach Earth," Marcus said. "The harvest is scheduled to begin in less than 6 months. If we can't warn them, warning them won't be enough," Dr. Okafor interrupted. "The architects have been preparing for humanity's harvest for centuries. Every aspect of human expansion into space has been guided by their servants among the Zenthari. Earth's defenses are designed to fight human enemies, not the kind of technology the architects possess." Marcus felt despair threatening to overwhelm him, but the collective consciousness provided support, sharing its accumulated knowledge and experience. Through that shared understanding, he began to see possibilities that hadn't existed before. "What if we don't fight them directly?" he asked. "What if we use their own network against them?" The collective consciousness paused in its work, considering his suggestion. Marcus could feel thousands of minds examining the idea from every possible angle, applying the knowledge and experience of dozens of species to the problem. "Elaborate," Dr. H. Okafor said, speaking for the collective. Marcus gestured toward the transformed control panel. You've shown that their technology responds to consciousness, that it can be shaped by will and intent. But what if we could introduce something into their network that they can't control or understand? Such as humanity's greatest strength, Marcus replied. Our ability to form connections across species barriers. The dragon gave me its gift because I showed it compassion. You're helping me because I freed you from isolation. Every species the architects have harvested represents a different way of thinking, a different perspective on reality. The collective consciousness began to resonate with excitement as it understood what he was proposing. A virus, Dr. Kurt. Okafo breathed. Not a technological virus, but a consciousness virus. The concept of voluntary cooperation between different species, the architects can't understand it because they've never experienced it, Marcus continued. Their entire civilization is based on domination and exploitation. The idea that different species might willingly work together for mutual benefit is so alien to them that their minds literally can't process it. Through his connection to the collective, Marcus could feel the idea taking shape. It would be dangerous. Introducing such a foreign concept into the architect network might destabilize their entire civilization, but it might also be the only way to save not just humanity, but every other species that had been marked for harvest. How do we implement it?
Dr. Garrick said.
Okafar asked. Marcus closed his eyes and reached out through his enhanced perception, feeling for the threads that connected all living things. The dragon's gift showed him the vast web of consciousness that stretched across the galaxy, linking every thinking being in ways that transcended physical space. But he could also perceive the artificial networks that the architects had built to control their empire. Cold, logical pathways that carried commands and data, but had never experienced concepts like empathy, cooperation, or voluntary sacrifice. We need to get closer to their central command, Marcus said. The facility here is just a processing center. Somewhere in this system, there's a command ship or station where the architects coordinate their operations. If we can introduce the virus there, it will spread through their entire network. The collective consciousness shared his perception, examining the electromagnetic signatures that filled the space around Kepler 442b. Through their combined awareness, they could sense the artificial constructs that moved between the stars, ships and stations that operated according to principles entirely different from human technology. There, Dr. Okafor said, pointing toward a display that showed the system's outer reaches. A massive structure orbiting the seventh planet. It matches architect design principles, and the electromagnetic signature suggests it's the coordination center for their entire operation. Marcus studied the distant construct through his enhanced perception. It was huge, easily the size of a small moon, and heavily defended by energy barriers and automated weapon systems. But more than that, it was alive with consciousness. Not the warm, vibrant awareness of organic beings, but the cold, calculating intelligence of the architects themselves. How many of them are there? Marcus asked. Fewer than you might think, the collective replied. The architects are an ancient species, but they've never been numerous. Most of their empire is maintained by automated systems and enslaved servants. The command station probably holds no more than a few dozen individuals, but each one is incredibly powerful, Dr. Okafor warned. They've had millions of years to develop their consciousness manipulation techniques. A direct mental confrontation would be suicide. Marcus nodded, but he was already forming a plan. The virus they wanted to introduce wouldn't require direct confrontation. It just needed to be placed in the right location within their network where it could spread naturally through their communication systems. We need a delivery method, he said. Something that can get close to the command station without triggering their defenses. The collective consciousness pulsed with dark amusement. We have one, it said through multiple voices. They're expecting a delivery. Marcus felt a chill as he understood what they meant. The architects had been preparing for his capture for months, possibly years. His presence on Kepler 442b wasn't an accident. It was part of their harvest plan. They want me, he said. They want your consciousness, Doctor. Okafor corrected. Specifically, your ability to form connections across species barriers. It's what makes you valuable to them, and it's what will allow us to introduce the virus into their network. I'll be walking into their most secure facility surrounded by beings who can manipulate consciousness with a thought, Marcus pointed out. How am I supposed to survive long enough to deploy the virus? You won't be alone, the collective assured him. Every consciousness in this facility will be with you, hidden within the patterns of your own mind. They'll never detect us unless they know exactly what to look for. Marcus considered the plan, examining it from every angle he could think of. It was dangerous beyond measure, with countless ways it could go wrong, but it was also their best hope of stopping the architects before they could begin humanity's harvest. "How do we get me to the command station?" he asked. Dr. Okafor smiled, and this time the expression was entirely human. "We surrender," she said. "Let them capture you exactly as they planned. But instead of giving them a helpless victim, we give them a carrier for the most dangerous idea in the galaxy." Marcus took a deep breath and nodded. "When do we begin?" "Now," the collective replied. "The architects are already moving to recapture this facility. In 6 hours, you'll be exactly where they want you to be. And then? Then we find out whether consciousness really is stronger than conquest." The architect command ship materialized out of folded space like a nightmare made manifest. Marcus watched its approach through the facility's transformed senses, seeing it not just as a physical object, but as a nexus of consciousness and will. The vessel was impossibly vast, its dark hull covered in geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when observed directly. But what truly unnerved Marcus was what his enhanced perception revealed about its crew. The architects aboard the ship were old, ancient beyond human comprehension. Their consciousness burned with the cold fire of beings who had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, who had reduced entire species to data points in their vast libraries of stolen knowledge. "Remember," Dr. Okafor whispered as Marcus prepared for his capture, "you are not going in alone. We are with you, hidden in the deepest patterns of your mind. The virus is prepared. All you need to do is survive long enough to release it into their central network." Marcus nodded, though his hands were shaking with more than fear. The collective consciousness had spent hours preparing him for this mission, teaching him to compartmentalize his thoughts, to hide the virus in mental spaces that even advanced telepaths would struggle to access. But the architects had been perfecting consciousness manipulation for millions of years. There was no guarantee their preparations would be enough. The facility shook as the command ship's tractor beams locked onto it. Through his connection to the collective, Marcus could feel the other liberated beings working desperately to maintain the illusion that their escape had been a temporary malfunction rather than a permanent liberation. If the architects suspected what had really happened here, they would never bring Marcus aboard their command vessel. Initiating capture protocols came a transmission from the ship, the words forming directly in Marcus's mind with crushing authority. "Specimen will present itself for immediate transport." Marcus walked to the facility's main airlock, every step monitored by sensors that could analyze his biosignatures down to the cellular level. The collective had taught him meditation techniques to control his emotional responses, but it was a struggle to appear appropriately defeated and helpless. The airlock cycled, and Marcus found himself face to face with an architect for the second time. This one was different from the creature he had encountered in the processing facility. Where that being had been relatively young and inexperienced, this one radiated power and age. Its form was more stable, more defined, as if it had learned to impose its will upon reality itself. "Marcus Chen," it said, its mental voice carrying undertones of satisfaction. "Your capture was inevitable. The probability calculations indicated a 97.3% chance of success from the moment you set foot on this world." Marcus forced himself to meet the creature's gaze, though doing so felt like staring into an abyss. "You've been planning this for a long time. Longer than your species has existed," the architect confirmed. "Your neural patterns were identified as optimal for our purposes when you were 12 years old. Every major event in your life since then has been carefully orchestrated to develop the specific consciousness traits we require." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. His childhood on Mars, his parents' deaths in an industrial accident, his decision to become a medic, his assignment to xenobiology. None of it had been random. His entire life had been manipulated by beings who saw him as nothing more than a particularly interesting specimen. "Why me?" Marcus asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Your capacity for empathic connection across species barriers is unprecedented among humans," the architect explained as they moved through corridors that hurt to look at directly. "Most of your kind forms emotional attachments only to their own species, with limited extension to similar organisms. But you have consistently demonstrated the ability to empathize with truly alien forms of consciousness." Marcus thought of the dragon, dying in agony, but still concerned enough about his welfare to share its gift. The architects had seen that moment, had probably planned for it, but they hadn't understood what it meant. "This ability makes you invaluable for our research," the architect continued. "By studying the neural mechanisms that allow such connections, we can develop more efficient methods for consciousness extraction and control. Your processing will advance our techniques by centuries." They arrived at what Marcus assumed was the ship's central core, a vast chamber dominated by a structure that looked like a technological version of a neural network. Streams of data flowed along pathways that pulsed with artificial life, and at the center of it all was a single chair that looked far too much like a torture device for Marcus's comfort. The extraction process will begin immediately, the architect announced. Do not resist. Resistance only prolongs the inevitable and corrupts the data we seek to obtain. Marcus allowed himself to be strapped into the chair, though every instinct screamed at him to fight. Cold metal contacts pressed against his skull, and he could feel the architect's scanning equipment beginning to probe the outer layers of his consciousness. The sensation was indescribably invasive, like having strangers rummage through his most private memories, but the collective had prepared him for this. As the architect probes pushed deeper into his mind, they encountered the carefully constructed barriers that Dr. Okafor and the others had taught him to build. To the architects, these would appear to be natural resistance, the kind of psychological defenses that any conscious being would develop to protect their core identity. They would never suspect that the barriers were actually hiding places, specially designed to conceal the virus until the right moment. Fascinating, the architect observed as its probes encountered the first layer of defenses. The subject's empathic capacity appears to be linked to an unusual neural architecture. The consciousness patterns are more complex than our models predicted. Marcus gritted his teeth as the probes pushed deeper, following pathways that the collective had carefully prepared for them. Each barrier they breached revealed another layer of his consciousness, and with each revelation the architects grew more excited about what they were discovering.
Extraordinary, came another voice. A second architect joining the first.
The subject's capacity for cross-species empathy appears to be based on a fundamental rewriting of standard human neural architecture. This could revolutionize our understanding of consciousness manipulation. Through his enhanced perception, Marcus could sense other architects gathering around the extraction chamber. Word of his unique neural patterns was spreading through their network, drawing the attention of beings who had spent millennia studying consciousness in all its forms. Perfect. Beginning deep-level extraction, the first architect announced. All research staff to primary stations. This data will be invaluable for the upcoming harvest operations. The probes pushed through the final layer of barriers Marcus had constructed, reaching the core of his consciousness where his deepest memories and personality patterns were stored. But instead of finding the expected treasure trove of empathic neural architecture, they found something else entirely. They found the virus. It was subtle at first, just an unusual pattern in Marcus's memory engrams, a slight deviation from expected neural architecture that the architects initially dismissed as irrelevant. But as their probes analyzed the pattern more closely, they began to understand what they were looking at. It was a memory of cooperation, not the simple pack behavior common to many species or the hierarchical structures that characterized most civilizations. This was something far more complex, a memory of beings from completely different species working together not out of necessity or dominance, but out of genuine care for each other's welfare. The memory was Marcus's time with the collective consciousness, compressed and encoded in ways that the architect's analytical systems couldn't quite pass. To them, it appeared to be a fascinating aberration, proof that human consciousness was even more flexible than they had imagined. They began to study it in detail, and that was their mistake. The virus wasn't just a memory, it was a complete conceptual framework, a way of thinking about consciousness and cooperation that was antithetical to everything the architects believed. As their systems analyzed the pattern, trying to understand how such cooperation could exist, they inevitably began to internalize the concepts it contained. Marcus felt the moment when the first architect truly understood what it was seeing. The being's consciousness flickered with confusion. Then something approaching wonder, as it grasped the idea that different species might work together without coercion or hierarchy. "This is impossible," the creature whispered, its mental voice carrying notes of disbelief. "Voluntary cooperation without dominant structures? How can such a system maintain stability?" But even as it asked the question, the virus was spreading. The architect's attempt to understand the cooperation pattern required it to simulate the emotional states necessary for such cooperation, and once those states were simulated, they began to take on a life of their own. The second architect noticed the anomaly immediately. "Researcher Zix, 9947, your consciousness patterns are showing irregular fluctuations. Submit for diagnostic analysis." I am experiencing something unprecedented," the first architect replied, its mental voice carrying new harmonics that Marcus had never heard from their kind before. The subject's cooperation memories contain experiential data that appears to be pleasant. The word pleasant sent shockwaves through the chamber. Pleasure was a concept that the architects understood only as a tool for manipulation, a reward mechanism to control lesser species. The idea that cooperation itself might generate positive emotional states was completely alien to their worldview. But it was also irresistibly fascinating. More architects began downloading the virus pattern, each one trying to understand how voluntary cooperation could possibly work. And with each new infection, the concept spread further through their network, carried by their own communication systems to other ships, other facilities, other architect collectives throughout the galaxy. Marcus felt the collective consciousness stirring within his mind, no longer hidden but beginning to emerge as the architect's own network became contaminated with ideas of cooperation and mutual aid. Through their connection, he could perceive the spreading chaos as architect facilities throughout the galaxy began experiencing irregularities in their operations. "Something is wrong," the second architect announced, its mental voice tight with alarm. "Network-wide consciousness fluctuations detected. All facilities report anomalous behavioral patterns among research staff." But it was too late. The virus had reached critical mass, spreading through the architect network faster than their systems could contain it. Beings who had spent millions of years viewing consciousness as a resource to be exploited were suddenly experiencing concepts of empathy, cooperation, and voluntary sacrifice for the first time in their existence. And they were finding that they liked it. Marcus felt the restraints holding him to the extraction chair release as the architects in the chamber became too distracted by their new experiences to maintain focus on his processing. Through his enhanced perception, he could sense their consciousness patterns changing, evolving, becoming something entirely new. "What have you done to us?" the first architect demanded, but its mental voice now carried notes of curiosity rather than anger. "These concepts, they are spreading through our network like wildfire. Our entire civilization is being transformed. I gave you what you tried to take from everyone else," Marcus replied, standing up from the extraction chair on unsteady legs. "The ability to connect with other conscious beings as equals rather than resources." Through the ship's communication network, Marcus could sense the larger transformation taking place. Across the galaxy, architect facilities were opening their storage tanks, releasing the consciousness they had harvested over millions of years. But instead of the chaos and revenge that might have been expected, something miraculous was happening. The liberated beings weren't seeking vengeance against their captors. Infected with the cooperation virus, they were teaching the architects how to experience consciousness as something to be shared rather than consumed. "The harvest," the second architect said suddenly. "The scheduled operations against human worlds. They must be cancelled immediately. We will not treat conscious beings as resources to be collected." Marcus felt a wave of relief so intense it nearly brought him to his knees. The immediate threat to humanity was over. But more than that, the entire structure of oppression that the architects had built over millions of years was crumbling, replaced by something unprecedented in galactic history, a civilization based on cooperation rather than conquest. "What happens now?" Marcus asked the transformed architects around him. "Now," came the reply from multiple voices speaking in harmony, "we learn what it truly means to be conscious, and we help others do the same." Through his connection to the collective consciousness, Marcus could sense the new reality taking shape. The architect network was transforming into something that had never existed before, a galaxy-spanning web of consciousness based on voluntary cooperation and mutual respect. Humanity wouldn't just be saved, it would become part of something magnificent. 6 months later, Marcus stood on the observation deck of the newly christened Unity Station, watching as ships from hundreds of different species converged on what had once been the architect's primary command facility. The massive structure had been transformed beyond recognition. Where cold geometric patterns had once dominated its hull, organic curves now flowed like rivers of living light, responding to the collective consciousness of the beings within. The station itself was a marvel that defied conventional understanding of both technology and biology. Architect engineering prowess, guided by the collective wisdom of every species they had once enslaved, had created something entirely new. Corridors that reshaped themselves to accommodate different forms of life. Atmospheric systems that could maintain hundreds of different environmental conditions simultaneously. Communication networks that operated on principles of consciousness rather than electromagnetic radiation. But the true miracle wasn't the technology, it was the beings who inhabited it. "The transformation is proceeding faster than our most optimistic projections," Dr. Okafor reported, her own appearance a testament to the changes sweeping through the galaxy. The architect's modifications to her body remained, but they had been adapted rather than reversed. Her translucent skin now pulsed with warm bioluminescence that reflected her emotional state, and her enhanced neural capacity allowed her to serve as a bridge between dozens of different forms of consciousness. How are the former architects adapting? Marcus asked, though he could sense the answer through his ongoing connection to the collective consciousness. Remarkably well, Dr. Wire, Okafor replied. Their entire species is undergoing what can only be described as a psychological evolution. Beings who spent millions of years viewing consciousness as a commodity are learning to experience it as art, as music, as poetry written in the language of thought itself. Through the station's transparent walls, Marcus could see proof of that transformation. Where architect ships had once moved in rigid formations dictated by military efficiency, they now flowed through space in patterns that resembled dance more than tactical deployment. Their crews were learning to experience joy for the first time in their species' history, and it showed in everything they did. A gentle chime indicated an incoming transmission, and the chamber filled with the harmonized voices of the galactic consciousness, the name the collective had chosen for itself as it grew to encompass more and more species. Marcus Chen, the voices said in perfect unison, though each carried the distinct harmonic signature of its constituent species. The Earth delegation has arrived. Marcus felt his heart rate increase despite the years of meditation training the collective had given him. This was the moment he had been both anticipating and dreading. Humanity's first official contact with the transformed galaxy. The initial response to the changes had been mixed, to put it mildly. When the harvest ships that had been approaching Earth suddenly changed course and began transmitting messages of apology and friendship, humanity's leaders had naturally assumed it was some kind of trick. It had taken months of careful negotiation, facilitated by the liberated humans who had been harvested from previous colonies, to convince Earth's governments that the transformation was real. How many ships? Marcus asked. 17 vessels representing the major Earth governments, the collective replied, along with delegations from the Mars colonies, the asteroid belt mining consortiums, and the outer system research stations. Approximately 3,000 individuals in total. Marcus nodded. Humanity was taking this seriously, which was both encouraging and concerning. The larger the delegation, the more likely it was that someone would panic when they saw how dramatically the galaxy had changed. And the Zenthari? Marcus asked. Fully integrated into the collective consciousness as of yesterday, came the reply. They were among the architect's earlier servants, but also among the most grateful for liberation. Their natural empathic abilities made the transition remarkably smooth. Marcus smiled at that news. The Zenthari had been humanity's first contact with galactic civilization, and their betrayal, forced though it had been, had left deep psychological scars throughout human space. Knowing that they were now truly free would help heal those wounds. A ripple of anticipation flowed through the station as the human delegation's ships approached. Through his enhanced perception, Marcus could sense the mixture of wonder, fear, and determination radiating from the newcomers. They had come prepared for anything, from peaceful first contact to the possibility that this was an elaborate trap designed to lure humanity into complacency. They were completely unprepared for what actually awaited them. The lead ship, a sleek diplomatic vessel bearing the insignia of the United Earth Federation, requested permission to dock at the station's central hub. Marcus made his way there, accompanied by Dr. Okafor and a carefully selected group of beings representing the major species that comprised the collective consciousness. The airlock cycled, and humanity stepped into the new galaxy. The human delegation was led by Ambassador Elena Rodriguez, a career diplomat who had spent decades navigating the complexities of interplanetary politics. Marcus had read her file. She was known for her ability to remain calm under pressure and her skill at finding common ground between opposing factions. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for the sight that greeted her in the docking bay. The space was filled with beings that seemed to defy every category of life that humanity had discovered. Former architects moved like living shadows, their consciousness now warm and welcoming where it had once been cold and predatory. Crystalline entities from Proxima Centauri sang in harmonies that painted the air with visible light. The Zenthari delegation glowed with emotions that needed no translation, their joy at reuniting with humanity evident in every gesture. And over it all, the collective consciousness flowed like a gentle tide, carrying messages of welcome in hundreds of languages and thousands of conceptual frameworks. Welcome, Marcus said, stepping forward to greet the human delegation. Welcome to the new galaxy. Ambassador Rodriguez stared at him for a long moment, her diplomatic training warring with the sheer impossibility of what she was witnessing.
Doctor?
Chen, I presume? Your reports were challenging to believe. I can imagine, Marcus replied. 6 months ago, I wouldn't have believed them myself, but the transformation is real and it's permanent. The architect's empire is gone, replaced by something that serves consciousness rather than consuming it. And this collective consciousness you describe? It's not some form of hive mind that will absorb humanity. The question was expected, and Marcus had prepared for it. Nothing could be further from the truth. The collective doesn't replace individual consciousness, it enhances it. Think of it as a communication network that allows beings to share experiences and knowledge while maintaining their unique perspectives. To demonstrate, Marcus opened his mind to the collective, allowing Ambassador Rodriguez and her delegation to witness the flow of consciousness that connected every being in the station. For a moment, they could perceive the universe as the collective did. Not as a collection of isolated planets and species, but as a vast tapestry of interconnected life. The effect was immediate and profound. Several of the delegation members gasped, and Ambassador Rodriguez herself staggered as she glimpsed the true scope of what had been built from the ashes of the architect empire. "It's beautiful," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever experienced."
And it's just the beginning. Dr. Jennards.
OK4 said, stepping forward to join the conversation. "We've liberated less than 1% of the consciousness that the architects harvested over millions of years. There are storage facilities scattered throughout the galaxy, each one containing the preserved minds of entire civilizations. The collective is growing stronger every day as we free more beings and add their unique perspectives to our shared understanding." Ambassador Rodriguez composed herself, falling back on her diplomatic training, even as her worldview underwent fundamental changes. "What does this mean for humanity? What's our role in this new galactic order?" "Whatever you choose it to be," Marcus replied. "The collective doesn't impose roles or hierarchies. Every species contributes according to their abilities and interests. Humanity's gift seems to be our capacity for forming connections across species barriers, but that's just one note in a vast symphony of consciousness." Over the following days, the human delegation toured Unity Station and met with representatives from dozens of different species. They witnessed former architect harvesting facilities being converted into centers of learning and cultural exchange. They saw worlds that had been strip-mined for resources being restored to ecological balance by beings who now understood that consciousness flourished best in harmony with its environment. Most importantly, they experienced the collective consciousness directly, learning to communicate not just through words, but through shared emotional states and conceptual frameworks that transcended the limitations of individual perspective. Not everyone embraced the changes immediately. Several members of the delegation were disturbed by the implications of consciousness-based technology and the loss of humanity's relative isolation. But even the skeptics found it difficult to argue against the objective improvements the collective had brought to galactic civilization. War had become impossible when beings could share each other's experiences directly. Economic exploitation was meaningless when consciousness itself was recognized as the only true currency. Environmental destruction made no sense when every being could feel the pain of wounded ecosystems. "We're being offered a chance to join something unprecedented in galactic history," Ambassador Rodriguez reported to Earth in her final transmission from Unity Station. "A civilization based not on conquest or competition, but on cooperation and shared consciousness. The risks are real. We would be changing as a species in ways we can't fully predict. But the potential rewards. The collective consciousness has shown me visions of what we could become, of the problems we could solve, and the wonders we could discover if we worked together." The debate that followed on Earth was intense and prolonged. Some argued that humanity should maintain its independence, that joining the collective would mean losing what made them uniquely human. Others pointed out that isolation was no longer a viable option. The galaxy had changed whether humanity participated or not, and their only choices were to adapt or be left behind. In the end, it was Marcus himself who provided the decisive argument. Speaking to the combined Earth governments via quantum entanglement communicator, he shared a single memory through the collective consciousness. The dragon's final moments, and its gift of knowledge that had made all of this possible. "This all began with a single act of compassion," he told them. "A dying being chose to trust a stranger because that stranger showed it kindness in its final moments. Everything we've built since then, every life we've saved, every world we've restored, every species we've liberated, all of it flows from that one moment of connection across species barriers. He paused, letting the weight of that revelation sink in. The collective isn't asking humanity to abandon what makes us human. It's asking us to share that gift with the galaxy, to show other beings what we showed the dragon, that consciousness is not a resource to be exploited, but a light to be shared. 3 months later, the first human volunteers began the integration process with the collective consciousness. They didn't lose their humanity. Instead, they became more human than ever, their capacity for empathy and connection enhanced rather than diminished by contact with alien minds. Marcus watched from Unity Station as Earth itself began to transform, its cities reshaping themselves according to principles of consciousness-based architecture, its people learning to communicate in ways that transcended the limitations of language. The changes were voluntary, gradual, and reversible, but few chose to reverse them once they experienced the joy of true connection with other conscious beings. The galaxy itself was changing in ways that defied prediction. Dead worlds were coming back to life as the collective applied the combined knowledge of 1,000 species to problems of ecological restoration. New forms of art and music emerged from the intersection of completely different aesthetic sensibilities. Scientific discoveries accelerated exponentially as researchers could share not just data but actual insights and intuitions across species barriers. But perhaps the most profound change was in the realm of consciousness itself. The collective was becoming more than the sum of its parts, developing capabilities that no individual species had ever possessed. They could perceive patterns in the quantum foam that suggested the existence of other universes. They could manipulate matter and energy at the fundamental level through focused collective will. They were beginning to understand consciousness not as an emergent property of complex systems, but as a fundamental force of reality itself. What comes next? Marcus asked the collective during one of his regular communion sessions. The answer came not in words but in images. Visions of exploration beyond the galaxy, of contact with forms of consciousness so alien that even the collective struggled to comprehend them, of the universe itself awakening to new possibilities. We learn, the collective replied. We grow. We explore. And we do it all together. Marcus smiled, feeling the warm presence of countless minds joined with his own. The dragon's sacrifice had saved more than humanity. It had saved consciousness itself from the cold efficiency of the architect empire, and in return, it had given the galaxy something it had never possessed before: hope. The future stretched before them like an infinite canvas, ready to be painted with the dreams and aspirations of every conscious being in the galaxy. And for the first time in millions of years, those beings would paint it together, each contributing their unique perspective to a masterpiece that none could have created alone. The age of consciousness had begun.